All right, chapter 6. Men's thoughts began to turn to spring, return of the sun, warmth when the Endurance would break out of her icy prison and they could make a new assault on Vassal Bay. Only once in the last part of June did they hear any sounds of pressure. That was on the 28th, and Worsley described it in his diary. Times during the night, a distant, rich, deep booming note is heard, changing at times to a long, creaking groan, which seems to carry a menacing tone. Starts up gradually, but stops abruptly. Sounds best in the distance. Greater the distance, better the sound. But then on July 9th, the barometer began to fall, very, very slowly. For 5 consecutive days, the reading slid downward. 29.79, 29.61, 29.48, 29.39, 29.25. On the morning of July 14th, the bottom fell out of the glass, 28.88. An ominous gloom came on about noon. The wind backed to the southwest and began to blow, but not much at first. It wasn't until 7 p.m. that the snow began to fall. By 2 o'clock the following morning, the whole ship vibrated as the wind screamed through the rigging at 70 miles an hour. Snow was like a sandstorm blown up from the pole. Nothing could keep it out. They had lashed tarpaulins over the hatches, trying to seal them off. By noon, it was impossible to see much more than half the length of the ship. Temperature was 34 degrees below zero. Shackleton ordered that no man venture further than the dog kennels, which were only a few feet from the ship. The men who fed the dogs had to crawl on their hands and knees to keep from being blown away. Within 2 minutes after leaving the ship, the blinding, suffocating snow blocked their eyes and mouths. On the Endurance's lee side, the force of the wind eroded the ice, leaving it grooved and channeled. On the windward side, the snow drifts 14 feet high built up, weighing probably 100 tons overall. The floes alongside the ship bent downward under the weight of it all, and the ship herself, with the load she was carrying, sank a foot. On the following day, temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero, and the dogs were fed half a pound of lard each to help them ward off the cold. After breakfast, Shackleton ordered all the hands onto the ice to try and clear the floes on the port side of the snow. The area around the kennels was becoming dangerously weighted down, and he feared it might buckle under, carrying the dogs with it. All that night the blizzard raged, but on July 14th the snow began to thin out, and by early morning there were patches of clear sky overhead. In the faint glow of light at noon, newly created high pressure ridges could be seen in every direction. They looked like hedgerows separating different fields of ice. Against these, banks of snow had drifted, but otherwise the howling wind had blown the surface of the ice free from the snow and polished it smooth. Before the storm, the pack had been almost one solid mass of ice, but now it was broken into pieces, and there was an area of open water to the north. It was a situation that made pressure inevitable. The ice, now that it was twisted and broken up, provided 10 million new surfaces to catch the wind. And each floe was capable of movement independent of the rest. The pack would move with the wind, and a kind of behemoth momentum would be set up throughout the ice. The resulting force is called pressure, and it began on July 21st. Not against the ship herself, for she was in the center of a thick, tough floe, but there were sounds of ice working toward the south and southwest. The noise continued all night and into the next morning. After lunch, Worsley decided to have a look around. He put on his knitted helmet and watch coat, climbed the ladder. Almost immediately, he returned with news that their floe had cracked. There was a rush to grab the Burberrys and helmets, and everyone dashed on deck. The crack was there, about 2 feet wide, running from the outer edge of the floe where extreme pressure had jumbled one slap on top of the other, to within 40 yards of the Endurance's port quarter. Sledges were immediately brought on board and the sea watches set. The breakup seemed imminent. They waited all that day and into the night and all the next day. No breakup occurred. Pressure could be heard all around, and occasionally they felt a heavy shock transmitted through the ice. But still the Endurance remained locked in an unbroken center of the floe. Crack on the port quarter froze over, and as the days wore on, without any significant change of their situation, sense of expectancy diminished. Sea watches were canceled, and sledging practice was resumed on a limited scale. Each time a party went out, they came upon pressure, and occasionally a demonstrated power the like of which had never been witnessed before. July 26th, Greenstreet went with Wild's team for a short run. Seeing some working ice, they paused to watch. As they stood looking, a solid blue-green floe, 9 feet thick, was driven against a neighboring floe, and together they rose as easily as though they had been 2 pieces of cork. When he got back to the ship, Greenstreet wrote in his diary, "Lucky for us if we don't get any pressure like that against the ship, for I doubt whether any ship could stand a pressure that will force blocks up like that." Among other men, too, the feeling of security was rapidly disappearing. After supper that night, there was a somber quiet in the Ritz. The whole party had been cheered by the sun's refracting image appearing over the horizon for just 1 minute after noon. It was the first time it had been seen in 79 days. It did not quite offset the general uneasiness. McNeish, who was never one to dodge the issue, came straight to the point in his diary that night. That the sun means a lot to us now, as we will have more daylight as we go along. We are looking for higher temperatures now, but we don't want this floe to break up until there is some open water, for it would mean the ship being crushed if we got adrift at present. 6 days later, at 10 a.m. on August 1st, while the dog drivers were shoveling snow away from the kennels, there was a tremble, followed by a scraping, grinding sound. The Endurance rose suddenly upward, then heeled to port, dropped back down in the water again, rolling slightly. The floe had broken and the ship was free. Shackleton was on deck immediately, followed by the rest of the crew. Swiftly he saw what had happened. He shouted to get dogs on board. All hands dropped onto the shuddering floe alongside the ship and went among the dogs, wrenching their chains out of the ice, hurrying them up the gangway. The entire operation took only 8 minutes. And it was just in time. As the gangway was being hoisted, the ship moved violently forward and sideways, propelled by the force of the ice driving under and in on her. Stout old floe that had been protecting her so long had become an attacker, battering her sides and churning the little dog loose to bits against her. The worst of the pressure was towards the bow, and all hands watched in helpless anxiety as the floes broke into fragments, reared up, and were overlapped by other fragments, which smashed into the green hearth sheathing along the waterline. It went on for 15 agonizing minutes, and then, driven from astern once more, the Endurance's bow slowly climbed up onto the floe ahead. The men could feel her rise, and a spontaneous shout of relief went up. For the moment, she was safe. The ice near the ship remained under intense pressure until shortly after noon, then settled down. The Endurance remained perched atop the ice, with a 5-degree list to port. Boats were cleared for lowering, and all hands were instructed to have their warmest clothing ready in case they should have to go out and walk. But all remained quiet throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Worsley, after recording the day's events, concluded the entry in his diary that evening. If anything held the ship from rising to such a pressure, she would crush like an empty eggshell. The behavior of the dogs was splendid. They seemed to regard it as an entertainment we had got up for their benefit. During the night, the wind picked up from the southwest, and by morning it was blowing a gale. These winds, compressing the pack ahead of them, had been responsible for the pressure. By morning, chunks of ice around the ship had refrozen into a solid mass. Curiously, in the general breakup, one large section of the old floe had come through intact, but had been driven against the ship and tilted at a 45-degree angle, so that a well-worn sledge track in its surface was now running uphill. Most of the men were put to the task of building new kennels on deck for the dogs. The job required several days' work, and amazingly, even before it was finished, the memory of what had happened was beginning to fade. On August 4th, just 3 days after the breakup, Shackleton came upon a group of men in the Ritz, speculating confidently that the Endurance was equal to any pressure. He sat down at the table with them. Shackleton said there once was a mouse who lived in a tavern. One night the mouse found a leaky barrel of beer, and he drank all he could hold. When the mouse had finished, he sat up, twirling his whiskers, looked around arrogantly. "Now then," he said, "where's that cat?" In spite of Shackleton's meaningful parable, the growing confidence among the men refused to be stifled. They knew now what pressure was like. They had seen the ship come through it, and she was none the worse for having done so. The returning sun also did much to raise their spirits. There was now actual daylight for about 3 hours every day, plus 7 or 8 hours of twilight. The men resumed their hockey games on the ice, and some spirited contests were held. An oversized Tom Crean, Harnessed up the puppies for their first attempts at sledging practice, his efforts stimulated great interest. Worsley observed, partly persuaded, mainly driven, they pursue a devious and uncertain course, even more erratic than the poor ships across the Weddell Sea. Again, in an entry on August 15th, Worsley reflected the general high spirits among them. In describing the intense rivalries among the dog team drivers or owners, Worsley related with a characteristic touch of exaggeration, some very tall bragging is indulged in by some in respect to their team's merits and performance. One team appears to suffer from heart disease, their owner evidently expecting the whole creation to hold their breath as they pass by. A vulgar person who indulges in whoops and yells of "Yoik Stally Ho" had the indescribable effrontery to let his horrid war cry whilst riding on the imposing conveyance drawn by those dignified but nervous creatures, was reproved by their indignant owner, pointing out to the vulgar person in what terror his voice had thrown the beautiful but highly strung and delicate doggies. It is my painful duty to relate that this awful vulgar person the very next day, being out with an ordinary team, gave vent to his fearsome bellow in the passing of the heart disease team. The result was disastrous. 2 of the poor creatures fainted and had to be brought round with hartshorn. The remainder went into hysterics until the vulgar person and his associates disappeared over the horizon. The heart disease team belonged to Macklin, who believed in treating his dogs as gently as possible. The awful vulgar person was Worsley himself. Another factor contributing to the general cheerfulness of the party was their drift. Ever since the blizzard in July, they had been blessed much of their time with strong southerly winds. During that period, they had covered a distance of more than 160 miles. But just at midnight on August 29, a single heavy shock struck the ship. A moment later, there was a sound like a distant clap of thunder. The men sat up in their bunks, waiting for something more to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, they saw a thin crack running out astern, but that was all. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Then, about 6:30 p.m., just as the crew was finishing supper, the Endurance shuddered to the blow of a second shock. Several men jumped up from the table and rushed on deck. Again, there was nothing except that crack astern had widened to a mere half-inch. 31st was quiet until about 10 o'clock in the evening. Then the Endurance began to creak and groan like a haunted house. The night watchman reported that ice ahead and along the port side was on the move. There was nothing the men could do, so they turned in. But a series of loud, snapping noises, which reverberated throughout the ship, kept them awake most of the night. Those whose bunks were on the port side suffered the most. As they lay trying to sleep, they could hear the ice scraping and battering against the hull outside, less than 3 feet from their ears. The noise stopped just before dawn, but it was a tired, jittery group of men who sat down to breakfast the next morning. Pressure began again late in the afternoon and continued into the evening. At night it was the worst it had been. Worsley described it in his diary. Just after midnight, there was a series of loud and violent cracks, groans, and bumps to the ship, making her jump and shake fore and aft. Many dressed hastily and rushed on deck. Personally, I got tired of the alarms against which we can do absolutely nothing. So when the loudest crash came, I listened to make sure that no ripping, tearing sound of smashed timbers was indicating an entrance of ice into the hold, and turned over and went to sleep. By the next afternoon, the pressure had ceased, and the Endurance had survived her second attack.